Tom Green, the key midfielder for GWS, has recently ruptured his ACL in pre-season training for the first time. Most ACL injuries tend to happen in pre-season or early in the season in sports like the AFL. I'm Monica, a sports physio, and in this video we'll talk through why it takes athletes so long to return to sport after ACL injury. As we can hear, it can be a season-ending injury that can take like 9 or 12 months, and why professional athletes will opt for surgery. Why does it take so long for athletes to return to play? Well, firstly, ACL rehab is dictated by criteria, not by time. So just because it's been 9 or 12 months, it does not mean the athlete is ready to go back. They can still be vulnerable of re-injuring their knee if they have not met their criteria along the way. And for example, we've seen this in various AFL athletes, like for example, Mitch Georgiadis. He took just over 12 months before he returned to play, whereas Sam Doherty took just over 6 months to go back, and that was after his third ACL injury. So the point being that every athlete is different as to when they'll meet the criteria, and we all have different contexts as well. So you want to make sure that you've ticked all the steps along the way. And so that means that some athletes might take more than 12 months before they meet the criteria, and then they're able to go back. Rushing the rehab process is just not worth it, with the risk of the graft failing and then the time that you lose and the consequences that can occur from re-injury. And there are a few other things to take into account as to why it can take so long to return to play after ACL reconstruction compared to other injuries. So we know that after ACL reconstruction, you can get quad muscle inhibition, and this can happen through various mechanisms. So it can happen locally, which we call arthrogenic muscle inhibition. And when you've got pain and swelling, and then because the original ACL is torn, there's then a disrupted feedback between the sensory nerve receptors and the brain. So the brain is then receiving less or incorrect information about the position that the knee joint is in, which can then affect how your quads are working. There are also central nervous system mechanisms that occur. So you see that the brain's motor cortex is reorganized and inhibited, and this inhibition causes the brain to limit how well it can activate the quad muscles, which means we then rely heavily on our vision and our sight for feedback of what our knee is doing, as opposed to relying on how the joint feels, so that proprioception and that automatic movement, which tends to reduce after an ACL injury. There are some rehab strategies that can help with this quad activation, so things like neuromuscular electrical stimulation and cross training, so they all help to try and get the quads to fire and activate nice and early. And you'll find that this quad inhibition can be a persistent deficit throughout the rehab, which is why it takes a lot of time to try and address this. Some athletes as well may not necessarily regain their quad size, so the size of the quad may always be smaller than the other side, but this doesn't necessarily mean that they're not ready to go back to play. The other thing to take into account is the graft healing and its strength. So usually around the 6-week mark after surgery to about the 3 or 4 month mark, the graft is at its most vulnerable point, where it's susceptible to elongating or tearing in this time. And this is because it's revascularizing with new blood vessels, and the organization of the collagen is quite poor. And this is usually why surgeons will advise for athletes to not commence running until after the 3 or 4 month mark in the rehab process. And this is where athletes will start to feel really confident, but the risk of re-injury is actually quite high for them in this phase, as the graft is still in the process of maturing and strengthening. Criteria-based rehab is still way better than time-based rehab. However, you need to still respect the biological healing process that's occurring after the surgery. And you'll find that after 6 months, the graft does get stronger, and it continuously gets stronger, where it can reach its full maturity from around that 1 to 2 year mark after surgery. So why do professional athletes opt for surgery? There is a vast amount of research of returning to sport after ACL reconstruction, and most athletes and clubs will opt for surgery in order to regain the knee stability, as sports like the AFL, rugby, football, soccer, they are highly demanding and require a lot of change of direction maneuvers, so you need a lot of knee stability to perform these safely and consistently. We know that the ACL can heal on its own. However, there are still more studies that need to confirm how effective this conservative method is with returning to sport, especially at such a high level, and how the outcomes are compared to ACL reconstruction. So there's still a lot more research that's being done in this space, but typically at the moment, if you've got knee instability and you need to return to a highly demanding sport that has a lot of change of direction, then the management is often ACL reconstruction. And most clubs and athletes will opt for this at such a high level, because the risk of going through conservative management, there's a lot of time that can be lost. So if they go through conservative management to only keep getting persistent knee instability and they're sort of stuck with the rehab, they might have then lost about 3 or 4 months of that time, and then they have to go and get surgery anyway. So most clubs would rather, and athletes, just get the surgery done, minimize the amount of time lost so they can try and return as quickly and as safely as possible. So the surgery will restore the knee stability, and knee stability is essential for professional athletes that are trying to return to a highly demanding sport that requires a lot of cutting and changing direction. In general though, for any person, when they rupture the ACL, they need to make their decision themselves, so they can get presented with all the information from different health professionals, but it's their decision at the end of the day with what they want to do with their knee. AFL has a lot of change of direction, landings and cuttings, and so the ACL has to work really hard to provide stability during the rotational forces and when you've got high ground reaction forces, so when there's a lot of quad force. And rehab doesn't just focus on being strong and symmetrical, but also how fast you can reproduce your force, as well as the reactivity and how consistent you are at reproducing good mechanics when you run and change direction, and then looking at that when you do that in a planned task versus an unplanned task, which is so important for AFL because it's so unpredictable and it's highly demanding physically, and then you've got a lot of pressures potentially within yourself but also externally that you have to deal with too. And confidence is a really important marker for return to play as well, and especially at an elite level it can be difficult mentally because you're at the club like almost every day and people might just be asking you about your knee all the time, and so it can be hard to not focus on your knee. I wish Tom a successful journey with his ACL rehab and hope that he gets a lot of good and positive support around him.